Okay, it is 1 o'clock. We're having people starting to come into the webinar. So I'm gonna start off a little bit. I apologize in advance for any coughing, getting over a little bit of something. So hello, and thank you so much for joining us for Kensington's first Upfronts of the year, our 2025 Nonfiction Showcase. My name is Larissa, and I am the Associate Director of Library and Indie Bookstore Marketing at Kensington Publishing Corp. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for people to join us since I know everyone's on, or a lot of people are on lunch break right now, and they got to get to their computer and grab their sandwiches and stuff. But in the meantime, I wanted to point out that we do have the chat option. Some of you have already been using it. So feel free to drop a line, let us know where you're joining from. We also have a Q&A option, and we'll be taking some audience questions at the end, depending on time. So please add any questions you have for our panelists today, and we'll try our best to get to them. So I'm just going to give it 2 more minutes, and then we will start. In the meantime, I'm going to start dropping links to the panelists' websites and to their Edelweiss pages to their new books, so people can take a look at them. I'm going to drop those into the chat. So I first dropped Meet the Kellys by Chris Enss. The second one is My Beautiful Sisters by Khalida Popal, and her website, girlpowerorg.com. In the Northern Sea by Tim Brady, and Agents of Change by Christina Hillsberg and her website. Okay, I'm going to start, now that we've had a few minutes to get people joining, and introduce our panelists for the day. On Kensington's marketing team, we have Ann Pryor, Senior Communications Manager, Nonfiction. She's going to be asking all the questions today. And the wonderful authors joining us are Chris Enss, author of Meet the Kellys, The True Story of Machine Gun Kelly and His Mole, Catherine Thorne, publishing on May 27th, 2025. Chris is a New York Times bestselling author of more than 50 books, focusing on extraordinary women through history. Her work has been honored with many accolades, including 9 Will Rogers Medallion Awards and an Oklahoma Center for the Book Award. You can find her at ChrisEnss.com, chrisenss.com. Our second author is Khalida Popal, author of My Beautiful Sisters, a memoir of courage, hope, and the Afghan women's soccer team, also on sale on May 27th, 2025. Khalida is a prominent figure in Afghan women's soccer. She has not only served as the captain and played a pivotal role in establishing the Afghanistan national women's football team, but also stands out as the founder and director of the Girl Power organization, among many, many other accolades and roles. Tim Brady, the author of A Light in the Northern Sea, Denmark's incredible rescue of their Jewish citizens during World War II, is on sale July 29th, 2025. Tim is an award-winning history author. In addition to contributing numerous articles, reviews, essays, and short stories for a wide range of magazines, newspapers, and journals, he has written and helped develop several television documentaries, including the Peabody Award-winning series Liberty, The American Revolution for PBS. Christina Hillsberg, author of Agents of Change, The Women Who Transformed the CIA, is on sale June 24th, 2025. Christina is a former CIA intelligence officer, writer, and recognized expert on women in espionage and intelligence tradecraft. She is the recipient of multiple CIA Exceptional Performance Awards. She now writes full-time, and her work has been featured in the Washington Post, the Seattle Times, Harvard Business Review, and more. And you can visit her at christinahillsberg.com. I'm now going to turn the program over to Ann to speak with our panelists about their fascinating new reads. So Ann, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to start off with some general questions for all of our panelists, except Larissa. We'd love for each of you to start by telling us briefly about your books and what inspired you to write your stories. I'm going to go in order of how I'm seeing you. So Tim, can we start with you, please?
My book is called A Light in the Northern Sea, and it's a story of the World War II in Denmark and the rescue and escape of the Jewish population from the Nazi occupation, which began in 1940. There were about 8,000 Jews in Denmark at the time, and 95% of that group of people were able to escape from the vicissitudes of the camps and the roundup of their population. And it was due largely to the work of the Danish people and Danish citizens who helped them escape from Denmark during the war, mainly by traveling across the narrow strait that separates Denmark from Sweden. It was a remarkable story, remarkable rescue.
That's perfect. Okay, I can't wait to hear more about this. Chris, over to you. Chris Enss, please.
I wrote a book entitled Meet the Kellys, a true story of Machine Gun Kelly and his ma, Catherine Thorne. During the gangster era in 1930s, there were many gangsters competing for top billing. People like Al Capone and Ma Barker and her boys and Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde. And then you have a wonderful married couple, Machine Gun Kelly and his wife, Catherine, who he was a bootlegger and satisfied to be so. He also robbed some banks. But when he married Catherine, she aspired for much more than that from him. And so they decided that they would begin kidnapping people, which was not unusual for the 1930s, but the way they went about it was quite unique.
Okay. Christina, it's your turn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the introduction, Larissa. I am the author of Agents of Change, The Women Who Transformed the CIA, and it is a look at the changing role of women at the CIA from 1960 to present day, and is told through the lens of the larger women's movement. So I start at 1960, at a time where women were told they could not run clandestine operations for reasons like, well, they could get pregnant and leave at any time, or they simply weren't competent or capable enough. But the women actually were far more competent and capable than these men had implied. And you had incredible women who were playing such a large role behind the scenes and really fought their way. And it really tells the story of that through these wonderful women characters through each decade and the types of choices that they're making with regards to their career and motherhood and elder care, choices that I think resonate with women, no matter what your career field is, you know, what it's like to navigate a man's world, and with that added allure and excitement of espionage. So, and I was inspired to write this because, as Larissa mentioned, I'm a former CIA intelligence officer. It wasn't until I reflected on my career at the CIA after having left 10 years ago, actually, in January, which is pretty wild, that I started to think about the women who had came before me and all of the things I was able to do at the agency, travel internationally, almost always alone, run my own clandestine operations. And it was really thanks to all of those women who came before me. And I started reflecting on that as I became a mother, and I'm looking at my 3 daughters and really starting to appreciate their stories and wanting to know more about them and tell them in a way that is very palatable and enjoyable and resonates with readers and women, no matter, you know, what your life experience is.
Excellent. Khalida, tell us about your book.
Thank you so much for having me here. Such an honor and pleasure to be with such an amazing lined up group of great people here. I wrote the book. It's called My Beautiful Sisters. It is the story of courage, resilience, and a strength of amazing young women of Afghanistan who took football, soccer as a tool and used the platform to be the voice for the Afghan women and to change the narrative in a male-dominated country like Afghanistan, where women's rights are always taken away from them, or many of our sisters back in Afghanistan, they never owned their voices, never had the ownership of their life. Football was a tool for us. And through football, we felt the patriarchal culture that were stopping us for our basic human rights. So it's a story of courage, resilience, sisterhood, community, and how we stood up as women of Afghanistan as a unit and fought for our right. There are some stories of how women and girls found their dream and their passion and purpose through football, and how they started fight. And it's my story, but also through my stories of many amazing women.
That's an excellent summary. And while you have the floor, will you also talk about what has been the biggest surprise for you writing your book so far, or in the process generally?
Yeah, it is my first book, and it took me a long time to accept that I want to write about my story, because it's re-traumatizing, it's remembering, it's putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. You're telling your story and giving it away to the world. So you become very vulnerable, but the amount of support that I have received, people who actually read the story, because it's first published in the UK, it has been amazing. And people that I've worked writing the book, been really, really good. But surprising is that I have the voice and I still can use it, if it's through storytelling or playing football on the pitch, anything that I can use to be the voice for my sisters.
Inspiring. That's really inspiring. Christina, the same question for you, please. What has been the biggest surprise for you so far in the whole book process?
Well, when I set out to interview my former colleagues, some of them were women that I knew, but mostly were women that I didn't know when I worked at the CIA. And I was surprised by how enthralled I would become with their stories and the relationships that I would form with these women. And what I found to be the biggest joy and the most rewarding part of writing this book was getting to know women across generations and forming these friendships, because we had this unmistakable bond because of this shared experience that we had. On one hand, it can be rather depressing when you're listening listening to a woman tell a story at the CIA from 1965, and it sounds very similar to what you experienced there in 2008.
Yeah.
You know, you're kind of like, oh, wow, things really haven't changed. But from a positive twist on it, it was really healing for me, and to know that we had kind of had these shared experiences and that we understand each other in this really unique way. And I walked away from the book with these incredible friendships from women, you know, that I didn't know from my time there, women, you know, into their 90s, and, you know, talk to them on a regular basis. And it's just been such a gift.
Amazing. Tim, how about you? What's been the biggest surprise for you in writing? This is your second book with Kensington, actually.
Yes, and
Your first book was Three Ordinary Girls, which did very, very well for us.
yeah, and I was Three Ordinary Girls was a book about the Dutch resistance, and three very young women who became a part of the Dutch resistance and actually became assassins and saboteurs for the underground movement in Holland during the World War II. And that story got me interested in general in resistance stories in Europe, and I've always sort of I've written several other books about with the World War II theme, and I've always looked for nooks and crannies in the bigger picture, and that's how I got into resistance in the first place. When I discovered the Denmark story, I was surprised at how little it was known to the American audience at the very least, and to a larger audience as well. In Denmark, of course, it's well known. It's their history and a proud history, but here it was so little known. But yet it's a remarkable story. As I said earlier, 95% of the Jewish population was saved during the war, and I think that's of note, and I think it ought to be celebrated more. And I hope that this does celebrate this one rare success story in the plight of the Jews of Western Europe.
Okay. Chris, close us out on this biggest surprise writing about the Kellys.
I loved being able to write about this. It doesn't seem like my book rises to the same level of you guys have such inspiring tales about what these human beings did. I mean, my biggest surprise is the fact that the Kellys, these gangsters abducted a 12-year-old little girl and took her with them on their exploits. And not only were they taking advantage of this child, but then even after she's rescued, how her family then takes advantage of her and sends her out on the road to be able to open different movies to tell the audience about her time with the Kellys. So a lot of exploitation of children in the 1930s.
That is remarkable. Now we're going to move over, and thank you everyone for sharing all of that with us. Now we're going to move over to individual authors who are going to have 5 minutes to talk about their books more in depth, and we're going to start with Khalida. The first question is, what was the environment like when you became captain of the Afghan women's national team, and how did it change?
Thank you so much. I am also one of the co-founder of the first Afghanistan women's national team. Football was my passion. In America, it's soccer. So I keep using football. That's where I feel more attached to this word. So football for me was passion. I played with brothers, I played with boys, but when that passion was threatened to be taken away from me because of my gender, I started taking a stand and decided that I will not let people in the community decide for me what I should do, or I should play or not play football, what I should belong to or not belong to. So I started a movement with the group of women and including my mother. And as a result, the first Afghanistan women's national team, the first league, and then the first Afghanistan women's national team was established, and we made history. It was so difficult. It wasn't easy process. We faced so many challenges, abuse, harassment, attacks, risks towards our life, and the challenges at home, where so many of our teammates were faced. It was a whole process and fight to get the recognition and to stand together and represent the women of Afghanistan, and to change the narrative about women, where the community or the country says women belong to the kitchen. And we wanted to change that narrative, that women belong to everywhere. And we are the new generation of Afghanistan. We are the strong women of Afghanistan, that we want to change that narrative. And we did it. We made history. We managed to get the recognition. We managed to that result. So many women and girls joined football. You're muted.
Sorry, yes, and the Taliban has made it very, very hard for women to have any type of voice now. So, which really ties into your work with Girl Power, the organization that you launched in 2024. Can you talk a little bit about your work with this organization and your efforts to get FIFA, and what is FIFA, and how that relates to the Afghan national team?
Sure. Right now, I'm living in exile as a refugee in Denmark. And so my journey as a refugee inspired me, and the experiences living in the refugee centers in the Nordic countries inspired me to use again football as a tool for integration and empowerment of women and girls, especially from marginalized community. And that was the establishment and the foundation of the Girl Power organization. And we also continued supporting the journey of football in Afghanistan, especially for women and girls. And when the country collapsed in the hands of Taliban, we managed to organize a campaign to get as many footballers, women footballers, and the national team to be evacuated to safe countries. It was a successful evacuation that, as a result, more than 600 women and girls with their family members managed to get to safe places in safe countries around the world. But since the collapse of Afghanistan, there is a ban on education, a ban on any social activities for women and girls. And sport is seen as something bad and against the culture and religion by Taliban. And the Afghanistan women's national team lost their titles, their recognition according to FIFA's rules and regulation. So we have been, it's over 3 years that we have been leading the campaign to get recognition, because we need our platform today so much as ever, because the women of Afghanistan and girls are living in an open prison, and a group of terrorists took over and vanished women from the society, and they have taken their voices. And what we are trying to do is, through football, to regain our right to play football and be the voice for our sisters. So we have managed, after 3.5 years, to finally start conversation and dialogue with FIFA, with the hope that there is some positive news.
This is also inspiring, Khalida, and I know that our participants are going to get they're just going to be stunned by your story, and thank you so much for telling us about you. Sorry, excuse me. We're going to move on to Chris Enss, the author of Meet the Kellys. Your book opens with a description of a new type of crime that was taking hold in America in the 1930s. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, the gangsters in the 1930s were all competing for different banks that they would rob from, and you had the Depression era, and there weren't a lot of banks that had an overflow of cash. You can rob a variety of banks, but you weren't going to get away with a whole lot of money, and so they had to come up with a different idea of being able to gain the finances that they could get from a crime where the risk wasn't going to be so compelling. I mean, there's no sense of robbing a bank with only $2,000 in it if you were going to get shot up in the process. And so they decided what they would do is they would begin kidnapping some of the most wealthy individuals in the country. And that's one of that wasn't even anything that was on the radar for George Kelly. Um, he was a bootlegger. He did rob banks, but kidnapping anyone wasn't something that he thought of. It was his wife who spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best people that they could go and rob. I mean, go and kidnap. And so I mean, you had other people that did that too. The Barker gang was doing that, but each one of these different criminals had a way of being able to distinguish themselves beyond the others. And that's what is so compelling about the Kelly story. I mean, they're one of the first to be suspected of kidnapping the Lindbergh baby. And then they are the first major test of the Lindbergh law. It comes into play with the Kellys when they're arrested. They're the first criminals to be transported by airplane for a trial, the first nationally filmed gangster trial. And it's when they kidnapped Charles Urschel from Oklahoma, it was the largest ransom ever paid in the US at the time of $200,000, which is the equivalent of 4.9 million today.
I'm muted again. And so you write about this kidnapping. Now, how did the Kellys know where this oil tycoon was going to be?
Well, Catherine was quite beautiful and quite the socialite among the lower echelon of individuals in the crime community. And she spent a lot of time going through newspapers, a lot of times going through celebrity magazines, and really scoping out who has the most money, where are these people located, what kind of a profile do they have in the community. And so she narrowed it down to Charles Urschel, who was a bank manager, and his wife was incredibly wealthy, and they were out of Oklahoma City. And so that's where they began with Urschel. And it's just a fascinating case because they kidnap Charles Urschel, and they bound his eyes and put cotton in his ears and did everything they possibly could to keep him from knowing where he was going. But then when they get to the safe house in Paradise, Texas, where they keep him while they're waiting for the ransom to be paid, he listens for when planes are going overhead and listens to how many animals there might be out and about. And so when he does, when the ransom is paid and the feds come in on the case, he is able to lead them right back to where he was being held because of, he made a note of when the planes were coming over, and so they could come up with a pattern of where their planes were going. So I mean, just a smart guy, and just an amazing crime.
Yeah.
And
yeah, you write about how this also leads to the formation of the FBI.
right.
So that's a whole other that's a whole other part of the story too.
Right.
So.
That's absolutely correct. Yes, right. And so
great. It's a great book. All right, thank you. And now we're going to move along to Tim Brady. Tim, your book, your upcoming book, A Light in the Northern Sea, we've been comparing this story to the civilian British mobilization famously portrayed in the movie Dunkirk, which I'm sure a lot of librarians are familiar with that story and the book. Can you highlight just a few similarities between those two operations?
Yeah, I'll give it a try, but this you should be forewarned that when I start answering questions like this, my kids quickly roll their eyes as I go on and on and on.
Okay, well, we only have 5 minutes, so try to whittle it down just
I'll
a
try to
bit.
limit it. The fact of the matter is that there, I've mentioned this several times already, that there were the Jews were about to be rounded up by the Germans, and how that came about was after the first occupation in 1940. 3 long years ensued in which the Jews were sort of left to their own devices by the German occupiers at the behest of the Danish population and government, which had this long history of treating all their citizens equally, and they had established a hands-off policy towards their Jews, the Jewish population, with the Germans. Suddenly, in 1943, for a variety of reasons, not least of which was that Germany began to lose the war, Hitler became concerned that the Jews of Denmark were being given a free rein in his estimation, and he decided that it was time to round up the Jews and incarcerate them, as he had most of the Jewish population of Western Europe. At the end of September 1943, the signal was given, and the roundup began in earnest. And what followed was the rescue or escape of this large group of Jewish people from Denmark to Sweden. And they were able to escape through the work of the Danish population. Fishermen, common citizens, resistance figures, all worked together to get the Jews in boats of any kind across the Øresund that separates Denmark and Sweden. And what followed in a compact amount of time, just 2 weeks, was the escape of this group of citizens. I'm sorry, that's about it.
That's perfect. That's totally perfect. That really highlights some of the similarities there. How did you, I mean, your books, your other book was very richly researched. Can you talk about some of the research that you did for this one?
Well, I always, in these books, I always look for a voice that I can employ to help tell the story. And so I look for memoirs, letters, first person accounts, so that I can get a sense from someone who is among the population, who is part of the population, and has participated in the action that I'd like to highlight. So I look first for individuals and family members, and so there's an abundance of first person accounts from the escape and from the resistance that enabled me to find those voices.
Yeah, that's and lends itself to the immediacy of the narrative, which is great. Makes it very readable and immediate.
Yeah, that's it's a necessity with the way I tell these stories, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, and now we are going to turn the floor over to Christina Hillsberg, our former CIA intelligence analyst. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So your book is called Agents of Change. Can you talk briefly about the evolution of women in the CIA?
Sure. So I mentioned a little bit about this. You had these incredibly talented women coming in the early years of the CIA, but it was long known as male, pale, and Yale is how we like to say it. And you had women that spoke multiple languages, could fly an airplane, but all they wanted to know was if they could type. And so you had these incredible women who were being underutilized. And so as we see through the decades, and to share a little bit more about the structure of the book, I open each chapter. Each chapter is a decade. So I start with the 60s, and the beginning of each chapter starts with a larger picture of societal trends for women at that time in terms of politically, socially, culturally. I'm using pop cultural touchstones like the Bond girl. This was our perception of what female spies were doing during this period. And then I zero in on here's what was really going on at the CIA, because some of these larger societal trends took longer to permeate the CIA than they did outside of the agency. And so we go from that in the 60s. You had women who were having to be very creative to find someone who believed in them, who was not a misogynist, who would sponsor them and give them these opportunities to train at the CIA's covert operational facility that we call the farm. And oftentimes women, if they were married to another CIA officer, which was very common, they're called tandem couples, they're also very common today, they would go overseas on their husband's orders, and they would become what they called contract wives, a CIA wife. They would actually fire the women, even if they had already had training, and let them go. And they would just be like not used, even though they were well placed in the field. And if they were lucky, they could come on and make pennies as a contractor and hope to get reemployed when they came back to the US. So that went on for many years. And it wasn't until the late 70s that they were hiring women directly in as case officers, which I use interchangeably with operations officers, which is someone who's actually going out into the field and collecting intelligence, stealing secrets, recruiting foreign agents, that type of work. And one of the women I profile in the book, who I think was instrumental in terms of proving a woman's ability and using the gender stereotypes to her advantage, is Marty Peterson. And she was the first woman to operate clandestinely in Moscow. And her story is so fascinating. And it really kind of showed how the fact that men, the KGB didn't even think to follow her. She had no surveillance on her. Of course, her station management thought it was because she was a woman and she was just too dumb to see them. But the reality is the KGB couldn't fathom the idea that a woman was capable of espionage. And so, while they were ignoring her, she was, going around, doing dead drops and conducting clandestine ops right under their noses. And so that continues to be a tactic that women use to this day. The fact that we are underestimated and that we can blend into the background and be, unnoticed. And that can be such a huge strength. And so we get through the decades, and ultimately we saw the first female director of the CIA in 2018, which was a huge accomplishment. And I think sent a message to women that there is a path forward for them. I will say, as I was listening to Khalida's story about her wonderful book that I can't wait to read, is that this parallel of, this celebration of seeing all of this progress, right? And so when I finished this book, obviously I've been working on it for several years. I had done a visit to CIA headquarters and was able to meet with them and talk about, the nitty gritty, the numbers, the ones that they would share in terms of diversity and what it looks like at the agency. And I talked so much in this book about how important, women are to national security and how we need these diverse perspectives and, women's rights, all these wonderful things. And as luck would have it, or very terrible luck would have it, is that now we are in a situation where I feel that it's more important than ever to amplify these women's voices, because the very office that I met with to talk about the progress of women at the agency has now been disbanded. The very groups that women started in their homes to mentor each other, the Women's Council, these affinity groups that have caused all of this like wonderful improvement, that has helped keep our country safe have been disbanded. And so I think it's all the more important to amplify women's voices now, in the same way that it sounds like Khalida is doing as well, because, you know, unfortunately, that's the direction things are going. And so I'm happy to do that in this book and to show, you know, how important it is that we do have women, you know, playing this role in national security, because we bring a different perspective. Not only are we ignored in the background and underestimated, but we have, you know, countless women told me in interviews that we simply have traits and an ability to run operations in ways that men don't, right? And countless women talked about their ability to be empathetic with their assets and build relationships with them and get them, particularly men, to open up to them in a way that they wouldn't open up to a male case officer because they're too busy trying to, show who's the manliest man, right? But they're able to kind of connect with them about their family and so many wonderful things that women bring to the table. And I think, lastly, I'll just say that I think, and this is a generalization, but I think, it's much easier to find men who've left the agency who want to share their story, their war stories. There aren't a lot of women who do that. Okay. It's just different. I mean, the women who I spoke with would never dream of talking to a journalist. But the reason I was able to get them to share their stories with me is because I was one of them, right? And we have that connection. And so I really feel that it's a huge honor that I'm able to share their stories, because it is, a very real possibility that these voices will ultimately be lost if they're not shared. And so, I'm just so pleased to get to talk about these incredible women.
Yeah, I want to say to the librarians that are joining us today that I hope that, like me, you can see that there's a thread across all four of these books, which is really ordinary people doing remarkable things, whether it's Danes mobilizing together or people who are trying to survive and they turn to a life of crime or women who are breaking barriers for other women, like Khalida is doing for her fellow women, and Christina is telling their stories. I think that is the thread across all of these books. And I think that if and when you decide that you want to take these books and shelve them and promote them and talk about them, that's one way that you can do it. So now we've got some very brief questions for the group. I know that we don't have a lot of time left, but very, very briefly, could you each tell, this one last question for everybody, to talk about what libraries mean to you. So let's start with Tim.
Well, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and I was in one of those families. Very, very lucky to have been in a family that appreciated the local library and had a mother who dragged me off to the library every Saturday morning with a stack of books. And I was one of those kids who really relished those visits and subsequently became a lover of books and a lover of reading and all of those things that we pat ourselves on the back for. But it began with that library. We had the library itself was I've just blanked on the name of the big benefactor for libraries. The well-known benefactor of libraries across the country. Sorry. Anyway, it was an old library, a beautiful old small town building, the most distinguished looking building in the town, really. And so it's just a wonderful setting for a young nebbishy little kid like me to hang out in and learn to love books.
Carnegie is
Carnegie.
volunteered from our audience.
It was a Carnegie book. Yeah, Carnegie
Thank you.
Library. And thank you to whoever supplied that.
Chris, tell us about what libraries mean to you.
Well, I think they are, and they have always been for me, the best search engine. You can just go and really dive into everything that you need to learn right there at one central location, whether it was my school library or whether it was the public library. I had a wonderful history teacher, which really helped me to fall in love with history. And she was a Goldwater nut. And I didn't know much about Goldwater, so I spent lots of time in the library reading everything I can about Goldwater and all the wonderful things about history that she was able to share with us. And so, just libraries are magical, and anything that you want to know is right there, and just incredibly important for anyone who wants to be able to explore anything about history.
Great. Christina, over to you. Same question.
I would echo, I too was a child who loved reading and going to the library. So it's very special to me to share that with my kids now. I think that the library serves as such an important part of the community. We're in the Chicago suburbs now, but I especially loved the libraries in Seattle, where we moved from about a year and a half ago. The one downtown Seattle, I love the architecture of them. All of the ones, we were in this little town east of Seattle, like at the base of the Cascade Mountains, and they just have this, they're just so beautiful and inviting and make you want to go in. So I love just kind of seeing libraries whenever I go to any town for that reason. But also librarians can be such an amazing resource. There have been various stages through parenting where I've homeschooled my kids, whether it was during COVID or whether it's been when they've had some health things going on, to be able to reach out to a librarian and for them to just like put together a huge tote of books for my kids, and I could just like come over. I mean, a lot of people don't even know these resources exist, right? So there's that. I mean, there's wonderful programs for kids after school things, and there's just so much to tap into there. So I just think it's a great resource, and I have a really, really cute library too in our new town that's like in the center of town. It's very like Gilmore Girls-esque, and it's fantastic. So love it.
Great. Now, Khalida, this is my ignorance showing, but are women allowed to go? Are there libraries anymore in Afghanistan? And I'm assuming women cannot go if they are there.
Unfortunately, women cannot get out of their home without male family member accompanied by a male member of the family, and any social, any kind of like places where women can go are not allowed. So it's just home.
Oh, that is heartbreaking. And that really speaks to the power, the innate power of each and every single book. Just to have a book is really just something to cherish. Okay, so let's stick with Khalida. If you could also just answer what do you hope that readers are going to take away after reading your book? How do you want them to feel?
Through the book, I try to talk about passion, purpose, and power in a not traditional way, but in a way that to empower others. So I found my passion through football, and I use that passion to give back to my community, to empower my community, to start a movement in my community. In my case, it's quite extreme, but there is always a need to take a first step, and that's one of the things that I want any individual who will read the book kind of find their power and see how they can actually play their role in the community, in the world, because we are drops, and drops make ocean. And if we play our part in this world, the world become a better place. Right now, it's becoming a scary place, which is scary. And the other thing the reason I wrote my book was to give the voice for the women of Afghanistan and to be their voices, so to tell their stories through my story, and with the hope that people who will read my book will keep remembering about the women of Afghanistan, the Afghanistan that was a past story, yesterday's story, and the world has forgotten about it. To not forget about women of my country.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Chris, the same question for you. What do you hope readers, how do you hope readers will feel when they finish your book? What's kind of a call to action if there is one there?
I think it's the history of crime in the 30s, and definitely how all of that helped create J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, and how all of that, even though it was horrible what happened, how all of it led to a significant agency in our government to be able to help fight crime.
Perfect. Okay, Christina, same question.
Well, when I wrote this, I really wanted to write the kind of history book that I would want to read. And what I mean by that is I wanted something that appealed to readers beyond like your history buff or your spy aficionado. I really wanted this to feel like something women could pick up and take to the pool with them or read on the airplane. And I call it my chocolate on broccoli approach, because you're reading about something that is very serious, but it goes down really smoothly and is digestible. And actually, I have to brag because Kensington did such a wonderful job on the cover, because I really wanted to convey that it is like a very fun book. And there are references to Madonna and Britney Spears and the Bond girl, but you're also learning about very important moments in history. And the most important, one of the most important topics that I do cover, that I guess I should have said this, that this was surprising, because I knew when I started researching that I was going to be writing about gender discrimination. That wasn't a surprise. I mean, that was part of it, right? But what I didn't anticipate was the pervasive level of sexual harassment and sexual assault through the decades that I would be discussing with the women, and uncovering. And so much so that I do discuss it in the author's note up front, that this was something I didn't plan on talking about in the book, but because it came up so often and in recent years has come to a head and is a current dilemma that the agency is facing in terms of, Congress created a committee to investigate their mishandlings of sexual assaults that have been reported at the agency. And so it is such an important issue. And so I am grateful to be able to shine a light on it. I think the call to action here is holding institutions' feet to the fire. We have seen a lot of progress over the past 1 to 2 years that the agency, thanks to Congress, making them do it, having to institute some very concrete changes. But we are talking a little bit like trying to steer the Titanic. The agency is not very nimble when it comes to change, very nimble operationally in the field, but right when you're trying to change an organization of that size and you're trying to change a culture that has been ingrained for decades, it is very difficult. And so I'm grateful and honored to be able to shine a light on this issue in a way that feels digestible to read and even fun at times, while also making sure that people are aware that this is something that has been happening. I want to celebrate the wins that where the agency has gotten them. And I was very clear with the agency about this too, because it may or may not be a surprise to you that anything I write has to go through the CIA's publication review board. And so I was very worried that they would be concerned about what I was saying, but I was very transparent with them and said, listen, I want to celebrate the progress that's been made. There has been incredible progress made, but I'm also not going to shy away from some of the more unsavory and moments and troublesome moments in the history and the current day that the agency is facing.
Yeah, it's like she said for the CIA.
Yes, we're a little late, but like we finally got there. But who knows what will happen now?
Tim, we're going to wrap up with you. Tell us a little bit about what you hope readers will feel and take away from A Light in the Northern Sea.
Well, I hope people are inspired by the story. I in a particular way, I would like to see people start to think about uh, resistance to a totalitarian regime and find some hope in the fact that there are success stories and even such well-trod territory as World War II that you can find inspiration in the story of the rescue of this population and these people and that will inspire people to look at modern day circumstances that may have parallels and to be inspired by people like Khalida and
Yes,
her story
absolutely.
uh,
Khalida put it beautifully. I think
yeah.
you know, every person is a drop in the ocean, and they're, yeah, it's very inspiring.
Yeah, and I just personally, I'd like to salute Khalida because I just think that your story is inspirational in the telling today,
Yeah.
and thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think we're gonna bring this back over to Larissa.
Thank you all so much for this today. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and we had a couple questions in the chat. One was specifically for Khalida. How are the players doing now mentally and emotionally in their new circumstances?
Since the players are evacuated, they have not stopped advocacy and advocating for women right in Afghanistan. They are traumatized. They are dealing with so many mental health issues, but football and our pitches is a sisterhood where they kind of come together as sisters and celebrate the unity and support each other through a tough time. But also they don't forget about bigger purpose, why we are here today and what we are standing for.
I can't even imagine. So thank you for being here. We had another question. This is for everyone. So much research goes into these books. I am curious how the authors decide when to actually stop researching and begin writing. Christina, do you have anything to say about that? When is too much research?
Yeah, you do have to make a decision, and researching this, it was kind of like a daisy chain in terms of finding more and more women. And then at some point, there's so many stories that you want to include and you can't always include it all. So, I think there's no like clear answer. I just kind of go with my gut. I think everyone writes differently. Some people have like very clear guidelines. But I think, I would just be kind of inspired to write a chapter and know, but you know what, there were so many stories that I wish I could have included and couldn't. But I'm sure they kind of weave in terms of in other ways and talking about the book and, in the way that I write and describe things. It all informs it, right? So even if one woman isn't a particular woman who's featured, her story and my interview with her was still, helped me formulate the story and how I would write it. So it's kind of, I don't want to say I wing it, but I kind of go with my gut there. But yeah, it's hard because there's always more research you can do. And I'm sure all of us here, we clearly like to research and write, or we wouldn't be in this panel. So
Yes. Chris, how about you? When do you stop the research and start writing?
I had to be incredibly disciplined because I love the research part of it. I love the deep dive. I love getting into primary source material. And it's hard because you can get off on rabbit trails and think this is so great. I mean, doing the research for the Kellys and then finding that wonderful story of, wonderful. But the little girl that they kidnapped, who afterwards then goes on stage to open movies, talking about her her time with the Kellys and how she's later replaced by Pretty Boy Floyd's son. Pretty Boy Floyd is dead, and they just bring on another child to talk about gangsters. And you think, wow, that's a book right there. Just these children.
Yeah.
And then, but you're like, okay, that's off topic. You got to stay focused as to what this is. So you really have to be disciplined. I love the deep dive, and it's a lot of fun, and it's hard to be able to say, all right, now let's go for this.
Yeah, I imagine there's just like so much on the chopping block at the end that is like, okay, how much does this actually help the story, and how much am I just including it because I like this informational tidbit that I just like, I personally love it and I want to keep it, but how much is it actually helping along the rest of the narrative? Tim, how about you?
Well, this is going to sound like a cop out, but to me, it's all part of the process, and I too love to dive into the research, but I also try to go into every book with an idea of what the book is before I start, and that sort of offers parameters for me, even as I'm working on the research. So I think I kind of use this self-limiting process as I'm sitting down to put the book together, and that kind of helps me put a limit to the amount of research I do.
Thank you, Tim. And Khalida, how about you? Did you have to do any research for your memoir at all, or?
For me, it was difficult to decide on the stories because it's several stories and to decide when to stop and in kind of which characters in the book that we told the stories. And I wanted to tell as many stories of my teammates as possible. It was difficult. We had some limitations, and we had to kind of find a way to limit and work on that, which was I was very sad. I was like, I want more chapters, more stories, one
Yeah.
more story. Teammate, her story was important. So it was difficult for me to kind of like find balance and kind of like few stories.
Yeah. Well, we're at 2 o'clock exactly. So, before we end, I just wanted to give another huge thank you and round of applause to Christina Hillsberg, Tim Brady, Khalida Popal, and Chris Enss for taking the time to join us today. And of course, to all the booksellers and librarians who took the time to join us for our nonfiction upfronts. Please contact me if you're interested in setting up events with these authors, having them on your library podcasts if you have one, or if you want any additional information about these books, just send me an email, Ackerman@kensingtonbooks.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy reading.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.